The station hung in space like a small city that had forgotten it was supposed to be on the ground. It had towers and bridges and docking arms that stretched out in every direction. Lights blinked all over it in different colors, each color meaning something different to a different species. Ships of every shape and size were docked along its outer ring. Some were long and sharp like needles. Some were round and slow-moving like floating boulders. One looked almost like a living creature, though nobody was completely sure it was not. This was Sovereign Station. It was the most important place in the known galaxy, not because it was the biggest or the most powerful, but because it was the one place where almost every spacefaring civilization sent someone to sit in a room together and talk instead of doing worse things. It had been operating for nearly 400 years. In that time, wars had been stopped here, treaties had been signed here, and a few very important misunderstandings had been cleared up before they became disasters. Every year, the station hosted what was called the Assembly of Recognized Worlds. It was a long meeting that lasted several weeks. Representatives from dozens of civilizations came. Some traveled for months just to attend. The meetings covered everything from trade agreements to new star charts to requests for membership from species that had recently learned how to leave their own solar system. At the main chamber where the assembly met was enormous. The ceiling was so high that the lights at the top of it looked like distant stars. The seats were arranged in a wide semicircle, each section built to fit the physical needs of the species sitting in it. Some seats were low and wide, some were tall and narrow. Some sections had no seats at all because the species using them did not sit. The air in the chamber was carefully mixed and cycled so that every species could breathe comfortably, which was a technical achievement that the station's engineers were very proud of. Near the back of the chamber, almost at the edge of the semicircle, was a small table with 4 chairs that looked completely normal compared to everything around them. This was the human section. It had been added 3 years ago when humanity was granted provisional status in the assembly. Provisional meant they were allowed to attend and observe, but their vote did not count yet, and they were not supposed to speak unless directly addressed. The 4 humans sitting at the table understood this. They had been briefed extensively before the mission. The session that day was a survey report. A delegate from the Vorkai stood at the center of the chamber and presented findings from the most recent planetary catalog. The Vorkai were an insectoid species. They had 4 arms, large compound eyes, and bodies covered in a hard shell that shifted color slightly when they were feeling strong emotions. Delegate SSK Irath was a senior xenologist and a respected member of the assembly. He was known for being thorough, precise, and occasionally long-winded. He had been speaking for about 40 minutes already. His report covered dozens of planets that had been surveyed over the past cycle. Most of the worlds in the catalog were uninhabitable for boring reasons. Wrong atmosphere, and no liquid water, too cold, too hot, no magnetic field. The assembly listened with polite attention. This kind of report was routine. It happened every year. It filled time between more contentious agenda items. SSK Irath moved through his slides with practiced confidence. He described each planet in careful scientific language, noting atmospheric composition, gravity measurements, radiation levels, and biological potential. Each world was assigned a classification. Class 1 through 3 were potentially habitable. Class 4 through 6 were difficult, but not impossible under extreme circumstances. Class 7 was the highest classification and meant the planet was completely unsuitable for any known sapient life to develop on. Class 7 planets were, in Eskarath's words, biologically hostile to complexity. He had classified 9 planets as Class 7 in this year's report. The 9th one was described near the end of his presentation, and almost casually, as if he was slightly bored by it, he brought up the data on the main screen. The planet was in a mid-rim system, orbiting a medium-sized yellow star. It was the 3rd planet from that star. Its surface was mostly covered in liquid water, which under other circumstances might have been interesting. But the data told a very different story. The planet had a magnetic field, but it was inconsistent and had reversed multiple times in its geological history. The surface experienced violent weather events on a regular basis. Wind storms, water storms, electrical storms, large rotating atmospheric systems capable of destroying almost anything in their path. The temperature swings across the surface were extreme, ranging from far below the freezing point of water at the poles to extreme heat near the equator. The planet's axis was tilted, which caused large portions of the surface to experience dramatic seasonal changes every year. The atmosphere was chemically active. It contained a high concentration of a reactive gas called oxygen, which was flammable and corrosive in significant concentrations. SASK Arath noted that this alone would make the surface dangerous for any civilization attempting to develop fire-based technology. The irony of that statement passed unnoticed by the room. The geology of the planet was also unstable. The surface was broken into large plates that moved constantly, grinding against each other, causing regular seismic events. Some of these events were powerful enough to reshape coastlines. At the boundaries where the plates met, enormous mountain ranges had been pushed up, and in other places, deep trenches had formed in the ocean floor. The biological data was perhaps the most striking part. The planet had a biosphere, which was unusual for a Class 7. Complex life had developed, but it was, as S. Kirath noted, extremely aggressive. The animal life included numerous large predatory species, many with specialized features for hunting and killing. The ocean was particularly dangerous, containing creatures of enormous size and variety. Even the plant life had developed defensive mechanisms that made certain species toxic or physically harmful. S.S. Kirath finished his description of the 9th planet and looked out at the assembly. "The classification is straightforward," he said. "Class 7, uninhabitable. I include it in the record because the biosphere is an interesting anomaly, but sapient life could not arise from such conditions. No species could develop the cognitive complexity required for civilization in an environment this hostile. Deathworlds, in a fundamental sense, do not produce thinkers. They produce survivors, and there is a hard limit to how far pure survival can take a species." He paused to let the point settle. The assembly murmured in agreement, or it was the comfortable sound of several dozen civilizations nodding at something that seemed obvious. Eskirath began to reach for his notes to move on to the next section, and then, from the small table near the back of the chamber, a hand went up. It was a human hand. It rose slowly, a little hesitantly, the way someone raises a hand when they are not sure they are allowed to, but have decided they cannot stay quiet anymore. The hand belonged to a young woman who was sitting very straight in her chair and looking directly at S.S. Kirath with an expression that was calm and careful and just slightly pained, the way a person looks when they have heard something they know to be wrong and have been politely waiting for it to be over. The chamber went very quiet. Eskirath stared at the hand for a moment. In 400 years of assembly sessions, a provisional member had never raised their hand during the survey report. He looked at the human woman. She looked back at him. She did not lower her hand. S.S. Kirath, more out of surprise than protocol, said, "The chair recognizes the representative from the human delegation." The young woman stood up. She smoothed the front of her uniform jacket. She took a short breath. "Thank you," she said. "I just have one small correction. Her name was Nora Hayes. She was 26 years old, which was young by human standards and extremely young by the standards of nearly every other species in the chamber. She was not the head of the human delegation. She was not a diplomat by training. She had a background in planetary science and had been added to the team 3 months before the mission because someone decided it would be useful to have a scientist on staff who could take notes during technical presentations. She had spent most of the past 2 weeks doing exactly that. She had not expected to be standing up in front of the full assembly. She had not prepared a speech. She had a thermos of coffee on the table in front of her, a data pad with her notes, and the specific look on her face of someone who had just listened to a scientific description of her home and felt the need to say something about it. Across the chamber, Eskirath was watching her with his 4 arms folded in a way that indicated, for a Vorkai, mild impatience mixed with curiosity. Now the rest of the assembly was watching too. Some of the delegates leaned forward. Others simply turned their many eyes or sensory organs in her direction. Cole Bennett, the senior human diplomat sitting 2 seats to her left, had gone very still in the way that people go still when they are not sure whether to be alarmed. Nora did not look at Cole. She looked at the main screen where the image of the 9th planet was still displayed. Then she looked at SSK Irath. The planet you just described, she said. The Class 7, the one with the tilted axis and the reactive atmosphere and the large predators and the tectonic instability. SK Irath confirmed that, yes, that was the one. We call it Earth, Nora said. It is where humans come from. It is our home planet. There are currently about 9 billion of us living on it. The chamber did not respond immediately, and it was the kind of silence that happens when a large group of beings all arrive at the same confusing thought at the same time, and none of them know yet what to do with it. Nora continued before anyone could find their voice. She reached for her datapad and connected it to the room's shared display system. A second image appeared alongside SSK Irath's planetary data, a simple photograph. It showed a blue and green and white sphere against a black background. It was a clear and beautiful picture. It was also the same planet SS Kirath had just spent several minutes explaining could not support sapient civilization. Nora walked the assembly through the facts in the same plain and careful way that someone might explain a map to a person who is holding it upside down. She started with the atmosphere. Yes, it contained a high concentration of oxygen. Humans breathed it. They required it. Their biology had developed alongside it over billions of years, and their bodies needed it to function. The oxygen level that SSK Irath had flagged as dangerous was not dangerous to humans. It was simply air. She moved to the weather. Yes, the storms were large and powerful. Yes, they caused damage. Yes, humans had lost lives to them throughout their history and continued to do so. They had also developed systems to predict storms, to prepare for them, and to build structures that could survive them. Weather was a problem humans managed, not one they had been stopped by. The temperature range was next. She acknowledged that it was wide. She then noted that humans had permanently settled every climate zone on Earth, including the polar regions where temperatures dropped far below the freezing point of water, and including the equatorial deserts where temperatures were hot enough to kill an unprotected human within hours. While they had done this not by waiting for the climate to become easier, but by making clothing, building shelters, and developing technology that let them survive conditions their bodies were not naturally equipped for. She described the geology. Yes, the tectonic plates moved. Yes, earthquakes happened. Yes, volcanic eruptions happened. Humans had built cities on fault lines, on the slopes of active volcanoes, in floodplains, in regions that experienced regular large-scale seismic events. But sometimes those cities were damaged. They were rebuilt. She described the biosphere. Yes, there were large predators. Yes, many of them were dangerous to individual humans. Yes, the ocean in particular contained animals of considerable size and lethality. She noted that humans had been coexisting with this biosphere for their entire evolutionary history, that they had learned which animals were dangerous and how to avoid them or defend against them. And that in recent centuries the situation had actually reversed. Humans had become the primary concern for most large animal species, not the other way around. She said all of this in a level voice. She did not raise it. She did not perform outrage or amusement. She presented the information the way a scientist presents data, one point at a time, clearly and without decoration. When she finished with the basic planetary description, she paused. The chamber was completely silent. And she could see delegates at the Vorkai table looking at their own datapads, presumably cross-referencing what she was saying with the records in the catalog. She continued. She told the assembly that Earth had, in its geological history, experienced at least 5 mass extinction events. These were periods when the majority of complex life on the planet was killed off by catastrophic events. Large asteroid impacts, volcanic activity on a continental scale, rapid climate shifts. Each time, most of the life on Earth was destroyed. Each time, the life that survived adapted and diversified again. The lineage that eventually produced humans had survived every one of these events. She told the assembly that in the last 10,000 years, a period shorter than many of the alien civilizations in this room had been spacefaring. Humans had gone from living in small scattered groups using stone tools to building a global connected civilization, developing industry, medicine, and mathematics, and eventually building rockets powerful enough to push themselves off their own planet and out into space. She told the assembly that this had been accomplished while Earth was still doing all the things SSK Irath had described. The storms had not stopped. The earthquakes had not stopped. The predators had not gone away. The oxygen was still in the air. Humans had done all of it in the middle of all of that. She then said one more thing, and she said it quietly and without any emphasis, as if it were just the last item on a straightforward list. So the classification system may need a small update, she said, because as far as we can tell, Earth is not an example of a world where sapient life is impossible. It is an example of where we actually came from. She sat back down. She picked up her thermos and took a drink of coffee. For a long moment, nobody in the chamber said anything. By then, somebody in the Dranathi section made a low sound that their translator rendered as the equivalent of a very slow exhale. The sound seemed to break something loose in the room, and several conversations started at once in several different languages. S.K. Irath stood very still at the front of the chamber. The color-shifting patterns on his shell had gone to a flat, unmoving gray. This, for a Vorkai, was a sign of extreme cognitive disruption, the shell equivalent of a blank stare. Cole leaned over to Nora and said very quietly, "I did not know you were going to do that." Nora said, "Neither did I, really." Cole looked at the chamber, which was still buzzing with noise. He looked at S.K. Irath, who still had not moved. He looked at the image of Earth still displayed on the main screen, sitting quietly next to all of S.K. Irath's alarming data points, looking exactly like what it was. "Well," Cole said, "good correction." Nora capped her thermos. "They had the wrong classification," she said. "It seemed worth mentioning." It started quietly, the way most important things do. The assembly session ended without finishing its agenda that day. The session chair, a Dranathi elder named Avon, called a recess about 20 minutes after Nora sat back down, citing the need to allow time for the human data to be entered formally into the record. This was technically correct, but not the real reason. The real reason was that the chamber had become too noisy to function. 3 separate side conversations had grown loud enough to disrupt the proceedings, and SSK Irath had not yet returned to the podium to continue his presentation. In the hallways outside the main chamber, the conversations continued in clusters. Delegates gathered in small groups based on species, leaning close and speaking in low, rapid voices. A few of them pulled out personal data devices and began searching through the open human records that had been submitted when humanity applied for provisional status. Those records were public by assembly requirement. They had been available for 3 years. Almost nobody had read them carefully. That was beginning to change. By the following morning, the human delegation had received 7 formal requests. 6 were from scientific offices of various member civilizations. They wanted access to expanded Earth data, geological records, atmospheric studies, biological surveys, anything the humans were willing to share. Cole handled the replies with careful diplomatic language, saying yes to all of them, and noting that Earth's data was extensively documented and freely available. The seventh request was from SSK Arath's personal research office. It was worded in extremely formal Vorakai academic language, by which the translator rendered into something close to. A supplemental review of prior survey data appears to be warranted. Cole showed Nora the seventh request over breakfast. She read it and said it was a polite way of asking to see if he had gotten everything wrong. Cole said that was probably accurate. Nora told him to say yes to that one too. It was Ivan who did the most thorough work. He was one of the oldest active members of the Dranathi delegation. A scientist by background who had moved into diplomacy over a long career but never fully left his scientific habits behind. He was tall, as all Dranathi were, with a smooth, mineral-like outer surface that slowly changed texture depending on his mood. When he was calm, his surface was almost perfectly flat. When he was disturbed, small ridges appeared along his arms and shoulders. By the end of the first week, Avon had a great many small ridges. He had taken the complete set of human Earth data and given it to a team of 4 Dranathi scientists who worked in his delegation's research office. He told them to verify everything independently. He told them to assume nothing. He told them to treat it like a first contact data package from a completely unknown civilization and to approach it with no assumptions about what they expected to find. They came back to him after 5 days with a report that was 70 pages long. The first page contained one sentence that Avon read 3 times before moving on. It said, "Everything the human representative stated in the assembly session appears to be accurate." What followed was a careful scientific confirmation of every point Nora had raised. The atmospheric composition was verified. The tectonic activity was verified. The weather patterns were verified. The biological survey was verified. The team had run their own models using the planetary data, and in every model confirmed the same basic conclusion. Earth was, by every standard classification the Dranathi used, a world that should not have produced a civilization. And yet the civilization was sitting in sovereign station, drinking something called coffee and correcting the survey record. The section of the report that Ivan found most difficult to read was the one on the geological history. His team had reviewed the fossil record that humanity had submitted with their original membership application. It had not been examined closely at the time because nobody had thought it particularly relevant. Now, examined closely, it told a story that the Dranathi scientists described in their report as without known parallel in the catalog of sapient species origins. Earth had been through 5 mass extinction events. The report listed them in order, with dates and causes. The first was over 400 million years ago. The most recent was 66 million years ago, caused by the impact of a large asteroid that struck the planet with enough force to change the climate globally. In that event, approximately 75% of all species on Earth were destroyed. The researchers estimated that the global surface temperature dropped significantly for years afterward due to debris blocking sunlight. The lineage that eventually became humans had survived it. The Dranathi team wrote in the dry language of a scientific report that the probability of any single lineage surviving all 5 events was extremely low. The probability of that lineage then developing sapience and spaceflight within the geological time frame humans had managed was, in the words of the youngest member of the team, a number so small it barely has a useful meaning. Avon sat with this report for a long time. He read it twice. Then he set it down on his desk and looked at the wall of his office for a while without doing anything. After some time had passed, he wrote a note to himself that he intended to work into the formal summary. It said, "We have been classifying these worlds for 3 centuries. We were not wrong about the worlds. We were wrong about what can come out of them." On the 4th day after the session, Ivan requested a private meeting with the human delegation. Cole handled the scheduling and asked Nora to attend. The meeting took place in a small side room near the station's diplomatic wing. The room had been adjusted for mixed species occupancy. so the lighting was a neutral tone and the air was a standard breathable blend. Avon arrived with two of his researchers. Cole arrived with Nora and Derek Walsh, the human delegation's geologist, who had been asked to come in case the meeting turned technical. Avon wasted very little time on formality, but he told the humans that his team had completed their review of the Earth data. He told them the findings had been significant. And then he said something that no one in the room had expected. He said, "I want to understand what it was like." Cole started to say something about geological history, and he could pull up further documentation, but Avon held up a hand and stopped him. "Not the data," Avon said. "I have the data. I mean what it was like to live there, to grow up there, to know what your world was and still stay on it." The room was quiet. Derek looked at Nora. Nora thought about it for a moment. She said it was just home. She said that when you grow up somewhere, you do not spend a lot of time thinking about whether it is survivable. You learn where the dangerous things are and you learn how to handle them and you live your life. She said that most humans had never seen a major earthquake or a serious storm up close. Though she said that most humans lived whole lives without being seriously threatened by any of the things on the list. She said that the fear was real, but so was everything else. The food and the sunsets and the cold water and the sound the rain made on the roof. Avon listened very carefully to all of this. The ridges on his arms were very visible. He did not say anything for a while. Then one of his researchers, the younger Drenathi, who had clearly been wanting to ask something for most of the meeting, leaned forward and asked if humans ever thought about leaving Earth permanently, if they ever wanted to escape it. Nora said some did. She said space colonization was a serious and growing field. She said there were people who had moved to orbital stations and off-planet settlements and who had no plans to go back. The researcher asked, "And the ones who stayed? Did they stay because they had to? Or because they wanted to?" Nora said they stayed because it was home. She said 9 billion people did not stay somewhere they hated. She said most of them loved it. Avon made a slow sound that the translator rendered as something close to a very long, thoughtful hum. He said he had been in the assembly for 60 years. He said he had encountered many species, reviewed many planets, participated in many membership processes. He said he thought he had understood in broad terms what the range of sapient experience looked like across the known galaxy. Then he told Nora that he was beginning to think he had not understood as much as he believed. Nora said politely that she thought that was probably a reasonable conclusion. Avon's researchers exchanged a look. Derek, who had been quiet through the entire meeting, poured himself a cup of water from the dispenser on the table, took a drink, and then quietly said that if they wanted, then he could walk them through Earth's tectonic history from the beginning. Avon said yes, please. They were in that room for 3 more hours. Word moved through Sovereign Station the way rumors always move through a place where a large number of intelligent beings are living in close quarters, fast, and in every direction at once. Within 10 days of Nora raising her hand, the story had reached every delegation on the station. It had traveled through official channels, unofficial channels, like the station's internal messaging network, and in several cases simply by one delegate leaning across a corridor to say something to another delegate. By the end of the second week, there was not a single representative on the station who had not heard some version of what had happened in the assembly chamber. The versions varied. Some were fairly accurate. Some were not. One version, which had apparently originated in the Paran delegation and then spread quickly to several others, described Nora as a senior military commander who had stood up and told the assembly that Earth had survived 10 extinction events and that humans considered violent weather to be a form of recreation. This version was not entirely correct, but it had spread the farthest, and people seemed to find it the most satisfying. Nora was informed of this version by Cole, who told her with a straight face and then waited. Nora said she had never claimed to be a military commander. Cole said he knew. Nora said she also did not consider violent weather to be recreation. Cole said the Paran had a strong sense of narrative, and she should probably accept the compliment in the spirit it was intended. The Paran were an avian species, light-boned, quick-moving, with large eyes that could each focus independently. They were known in the assembly for being energetic, extremely curious, and occasionally exhausting to other species because of how many questions they asked. Their delegation had 6 members, all of whom had been visibly agitated since the session where Nora had spoken. The most agitated of the 6 was a Paran scholar named Rivaz. He had formally requested access to the complete human historical archive 3 days after the session. Cole had approved the request, somewhat surprised that anyone wanted access to such a large volume of material. The human historical archive was enormous. Tens of thousands of documents, recordings, and data files covering everything from ancient prehistory to the most recent decades. Rivaz had begun reading immediately. He had not stopped. On the 6th day after he started, one of his colleagues checked on him and found that he had not left his research station in all that time. Paran could survive without sleep for 8 or 9 days before it became a health concern, so this was physically possible, if not entirely recommended. His colleague reported that Rivaz had surrounded himself with display screens, that he had organized his reading into categories using a system of color-coded markers, and that when asked how he was doing, he had said, without looking up, that he had just reached the part about the Second World War and needed a moment. His colleague left him alone. Rivaz eventually emerged on the 8th day. He found Derek in the station's common eating area and sat down across from him without introduction. Derek, who had been calmly eating lunch, looked up. Rivaz said he had a question. Derek said that was fine. Rivaz asked, how many of the things in the Human Historical Archive were true? Derek thought about this for a moment and then said, to the best of his knowledge, most of them. Rivaz stared at him with both eyes at once, which for a Paran indicated deep focus. He asked specifically about the part where humans had discovered that their planet had been struck by a large asteroid and that this asteroid had killed most of the life on Earth. And then, instead of finding this frightening, humans had started programs to track other large asteroids and had eventually developed plans to redirect them if one was heading toward Earth again. Derek said yes. That was accurate. Rivaz said he had also read about the part where humans had discovered that their planet's own magnetic field reversed itself periodically, and that during a reversal, the surface was exposed to significantly higher radiation levels. Derek said yes, that had also happened several times. Rivaz asked if humans found that upsetting. Derek thought about it and said that most people found it interesting more than upsetting, and that there was active research into what the next reversal might do and how to prepare for it. Rivaz was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had been a scholar for 30 years and had read histories of 11 different spacefaring civilizations, and that not one of them had a history anything like what he had just read. He said most species, when they encountered a major threat, developed strategies to avoid it or to move away from it. And he said humans seemed to have developed a different strategy, which was to understand the threat thoroughly and then continue living near it. Derek said that was a fair description. Rivaz said he found this both terrifying and wonderful. Derek said most humans would probably accept that as a compliment. While Rivaz was having this conversation, the political work was happening on a different level of the station. There were 3 civilizations that had been quietly lobbying against human full membership for the past 2 years. They had never said openly that they did not want humans in the assembly. Instead, they had raised procedural questions about humanity's readiness, suggested the provisional period should be extended for standard reasons, and generally used the slow, grinding machinery of galactic bureaucracy to delay any formal vote. This was normal political behavior in the assembly. It had been used many times before to keep newer or smaller civilizations in provisional status longer than necessary. Cole had known about this opposition for the entire mission. He had been working against it through patient diplomatic conversations and small-scale coalition building. Before the session where Nora spoke, he had a realistic count of about 42% of voting members likely to support full membership. Not enough. After the session, he ran the count again. It had moved. And it had moved not because of any new treaty or promise or trade arrangement. It had moved because a lot of delegates had read Earth data for the first time and come away thinking differently about what humans were. The conversations Cole was having now were different from the ones he had been having before. People were not asking him whether humans were ready. They were asking him things like whether human colonization technology was as advanced as the planetary science suggested, and whether humanity had any existing research on multi-environment habitability, and whether humans had ever considered sharing some of their geological survey methodology. Cole answered all of these questions carefully and professionally. He did not oversell. He made no promises he could not keep. He was honest about what humanity could and could not offer. But he made sure that every conversation ended with the other delegation knowing that humanity intended to be a full and contributing member of the assembly and that a yes vote was in everyone's interest. The count moved to 51%, then 55%. Then, after a long conversation with the Ulm delegation that lasted most of an afternoon and involved Yvonne sitting in as an informal facilitator, it moved to 61%. Nora was not part of these conversations. And she was doing something else. She had been given access to the full updated survey catalog as part of the expanded data sharing that had followed the session. She had been going through it methodically, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she had a scientific background and the catalog was interesting and she had time in the evenings. On the 12th day after the session, she found something. It was a planet in the outer rim. It had been classified as Class 7 8 years ago by a previous survey mission. The classification notes described it in similar terms to Earth: high atmospheric activity, strong surface radiation, active geology, complex chemical environment. The survey team had noted it and moved on. What they had not flagged, or perhaps had not known to look for, was a set of readings buried in the atmospheric chemistry data. Nora found them while she was cross-checking the catalog's oxygen readings against Earth's atmospheric history. The planet had trace concentrations of amino acid precursor compounds in its upper atmosphere. These were complex organic molecules that, on Earth, appeared in large quantities before life took hold in the oceans. They were not proof of life. They were not even proof that life was likely. But they were a sign that chemistry was happening on that planet in a direction that was not random. Nora sat with this for 2 days. She rechecked her reading 3 times. She asked Derek to look at it without telling him what she thought it was. He came back the next morning and said quietly that he thought someone should probably resurvey that planet. Nora agreed. She wrote up her findings in a short document, cross-referenced it against Earth's early biological markers, and set it aside. But there was no urgency. Whatever was happening on that planet, if anything was happening at all, was happening on a geological timescale. But she wanted the record to exist. She mentioned it to Cole that evening after dinner. She said it quietly and without any drama. Cole listened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that if something was in fact beginning to grow on that world, and if it followed anything like Earth's timeline, they were looking at roughly 1 billion years before it would be anyone's problem to deal with. Nora said she knew that. She said she still thought someone should keep an eye on it. Cole said he thought she was probably right. Outside the observation window, the stars were steady and unchanged. Somewhere among them, a Class 7 planet continued doing what Class 7 planets did. It did not know it was being watched. And it did not know that a human scientist on a diplomatic station had just added it to a personal watch list. It did not know that, for the first time in the assembled galaxy's long-recorded history, someone was looking at a world like that and not writing it off. It just kept going. The vote happened on a Tuesday, by the human way of counting days. It was not a dramatic event in the end. There was no long debate before the vote. There was no speech from the human delegation, no last-minute maneuvering from the opposing bloc. Cole had done his work carefully and quietly over 3 weeks, one conversation at a time, and by the morning of the vote he already knew more or less how it was going to go. He had been doing this kind of work for 20 years. He knew what a solid count felt like. The session chair called the vote in the middle of the morning. Every delegation registered their position on the shared system. The results appeared on the main screen within a few seconds. Full membership status for humanity had passed. The margin was not large enough to call it a landslide, but it was clear, and it was real. Cole sat back in his chair and let out a slow breath through his nose. He did not make a large show of it. He had learned a long time ago that the moment right after a diplomatic win was not the moment to celebrate loudly. Because you were still in the room with the people who had just voted against you, and you would need to work with all of them eventually. Nora was sitting beside him. She had brought her thermos, as she always did. She looked at the number on the screen, and then looked at Cole, and he gave her a single small nod. She nodded back and poured herself some coffee. Derek, on Cole's other side, stared at the screen for a moment and then folded his hands on the table in front of him and said very quietly that it was about time. Cole told him to keep his voice down. Derek said yes, of course, and kept his voice down. The formal ceremony was scheduled for the following afternoon. It was a standard assembly ceremony, the kind that had been used for every new full member over the past 400 years. There would be a short acknowledgement from the session chair, then a brief statement from the new member delegation, and then a recording of the moment would be added to the station's permanent archive. Cole wrote the statement himself that evening. It was 3 paragraphs. He read it to Nora and Derek the next morning over breakfast and asked if anything needed to change. Nora suggested removing 2 sentences that she thought sounded like they were trying too hard. Cole agreed and took them out. Derek suggested adding something about future scientific cooperation. Cole said he would think about it, and then incorporated a version of it into the second paragraph without making it obvious he had used Derek's idea, which Derek did not seem to mind. The ceremony itself was brief. The chamber was full but quiet. Avon read the formal acknowledgement in the measured, unhurried way that Dranathi spoke. The ridges on his arms were mostly smooth. Cole read the statement, which was short and honest, and did not mention Earth being a death world even once, because Cole had the diplomatic instinct to know that some truths were better left implied. Afterward, in the corridor outside the chamber, Eskirath was waiting. He was standing slightly to one side of the main doorway. When the human delegation came out, he looked at them, and then specifically at Nora, in a way that was clearly intentional. Nora saw him and slowed down. Cole continued walking at a slightly reduced pace, keeping himself close without interrupting. Seske Irath told Nora that he had submitted the formal revision to his survey report. He said the correction had been recorded and that his original classification of Earth had been officially changed in the catalog. He said it in the tone of someone completing an administrative task, which was almost certainly intentional. Nora said she appreciated that. There was a short silence. ESS Karath's shell shifted color slightly in a pattern that his people sometimes showed when they were trying to find words that did not come easily. He said that his survey classification system had been in use for 320 years. He said that in that entire time it had never encountered a case that it failed to account for properly. He said he found it difficult to determine whether this meant the system was very good or whether it simply meant he had been very fortunate in the worlds he had been asked to classify. Nora thought about this for a moment. She told him she thought it probably meant both, and that neither one was a problem. She said that a system that worked well for 300 years was a good system, and that the fact that it needed an update now was not a failure of the system. It was just new data. She said new data was supposed to change things. That was what it was for. Eskarath looked at her. The color pattern on his shell slowed and settled. Nora said that if he was interested, she had been thinking about how the classification framework could be revised. She said she had some notes. She said a reworked version would need both a xenological perspective and a planetary science perspective, and that those two things working together were probably more useful than either one alone. Eskarath asked if she was proposing that they collaborate. Nora said she was. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that seemed like a reasonable approach. He said the revised framework should probably be named for whoever contributed most substantially to it. Nora said she had been thinking they could call it the Hayes-Eskarath revision, with his name second because the alphabetical ordering worked better that way. Eskarath looked at her carefully. She looked back at him with a completely neutral expression. After a moment, he said that the alphabetical logic was sound, and he accepted. They agreed to begin corresponding the following week. Eskarath left. Cole, who had been standing just far enough away to have plausible deniability about whether he had heard any of that, walked back over to Nora and said nothing. Nora finished the last of her coffee. That evening, and the human delegation held a small gathering in the common area near their quarters. It was not a party, there was no formal occasion, and they were all tired enough that a real party seemed like too much effort. It was more that 4 people who had been working very hard for a long time sat in a comfortable room together with food and drinks and did not talk about work for a while. Rivaz arrived about an hour in. Nobody had invited him because nobody had known he was coming. But when the door opened and he appeared, Derek waved him in immediately and moved over to make room at the table. Rivaz had a datapad tucked under one wing and the expression of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity to ask questions. He sat down, put the datapad on the table, and asked Derek if they could talk about subduction zones. Derek said absolutely, and what aspect of subduction zones specifically. They were still talking 2 hours later. Rivaz had moved from subduction zones to ocean trench formation to the conditions on early Earth before the atmosphere had significant oxygen, and Derek had pulled up several diagrams on his own datapad and was explaining the geological timeline with the level of detailed enthusiasm that he reserved for topics he found genuinely wonderful. Rivaz was taking notes so fast his stylus was a blur. Cole had fallen asleep in his chair at some point and nobody woke him because he had earned it. As Nora was sitting by the observation window, space outside was deep and still and full of the same stars it always had been. She was not thinking about the vote or the ceremony or the classification revision or any of the things that had happened over the past 3 weeks. She was thinking about the Class 7 planet with the amino acid readings. She was thinking about what it looked like from orbit. A hard world, an active world, a world that was doing complicated chemistry in its atmosphere and probably had no idea anything significant was happening. She was thinking about what it would be like in some unimaginable stretch of future time if something grew there, looked up, figured out the stars, built a ship, and showed up somewhere like this to take a seat. She was thinking about who would be in that room and what they would think when they looked at the data, and whether someone would have the records to understand what they were actually looking at. She hoped they would. She had put the planet in the record. Someone eventually would find the note. She did not know who. She did not need to. She finished her coffee, capped the thermos, set it down on the windowsill, and watched the stars for a while longer. Behind her, Derek was explaining the Cambrian explosion to Rivaz, who had both eyes wide open and was writing so fast he had already filled 6 pages. Cole was asleep and breathing evenly. Somewhere on a different part of the station, Avon was probably in his office, rereading some section of a very long report with small ridges forming slowly along his arms. And somewhere in the outer rim, an unremarkable planet continued its quiet, violent, complicated work. It had no name yet. No one had given it one. But it was in the record now, and that was a start.